Welcome back to another journey through the cosmos. Tonight, we're stepping into the halls of the Citadel, that ancient station where millions of beings from across the galaxy converge, where decisions that reshape entire civilizations are made over diplomatic tea, and where the most powerful government in known space operates without a single standing army of its own. We're exploring the Citadel Council and its shadowy enforcers, the Spectres, examining how power moves through the galaxy, not with fleets and declarations of war, but through whispers in corridors, through agents who answer to no law, and through influence so carefully cultivated that most species don't realize they're being guided until they've already followed the path laid before them. The Citadel hangs in space like a flower frozen mid-bloom, its 5 enormous arms stretching outward from a central ring, each arm housing millions of souls in cities that never truly sleep. To approach it for the first time is to feel insignificance and wonder in equal measure. This isn't just a space station, it's the beating heart of galactic civilization, the place where cultures collide and somehow coexist, where a Hanar mystic might share an elevator with a Krogan mercenary, where the air carries 100 different languages, and the markets sell goods from 1,000 worlds. But beneath this magnificent chaos, beneath the surface diversity and apparent freedom, runs a current of control so subtle that most never feel its pull. At the apex of this structure, literally and figuratively, sit 3 beings in a tower that rises from the Presidium like a needle pointing toward infinity, the Citadel Council. An Asari, a Solarian, and a Turian, each representing their species and wielding power that spans light years. They pass no laws that bind independent governments. They command no armies that march under their flag alone. They cannot force any sovereign species to obey their dictates. And yet, when the Council speaks, the galaxy listens. When they disapprove, entire political careers end. When they act, even the most distant colony worlds feel the ripples. This is power as art form, governance as subtle manipulation, authority earned through 2,500 years of careful cultivation. The Council doesn't rule through force, it rules through precedent, through reputation, through the accumulated weight of centuries of decisions that somehow always turned out to be correct. It rules through the unspoken threat of isolation, of being cast out from the galactic community, of losing access to the networks of trade and protection that bind civilization together. And when soft power fails, when whispers and warnings prove insufficient, the Council has another tool in its arsenal: the Spectres. These agents exist in the spaces between law and chaos, granted authority that supersedes every legal code in Citadel space, while being bound by none of them. They are chosen, not trained, selected from the finest operatives of various species and given a simple mandate: preserve galactic stability by any means necessary. Any means. The emphasis on those words cannot be overstated. A Spectre can walk into a corporate boardroom and execute the CEO without charges, without trial, without consequence beyond their own conscience. They can level a city block to stop a terrorist, can torture for information, can make entire problems disappear into the void of space with no one to question their methods. Most citizens of Citadel space will never meet a Spectre. Many don't know their names, or even believe they truly exist beyond the action vids that portray them as galactic superheroes. This anonymity is intentional, cultivated, essential to their function. The Spectres are myth made flesh. The boogeyman that keeps pirates and terrorists looking over their shoulders. The invisible hand that corrects problems before they become crises. They are the Council's will made manifest, operating in shadows while the Council itself basks in the light of diplomatic reception halls. Together, the Council and the Spectres form a system of governance unlike anything humanity ever developed on Earth. It's not democracy, though democratic races participate. It's not autocracy, though the Council's word carries autocratic weight. It's not theocracy, though some species treat Council decisions with religious reverence. It's something else entirely. A unique evolution of political power adapted to the specific challenges of governing across species lines, across vast distances, across cultures so different that fundamental assumptions about reality itself vary between them. To understand this system, to really comprehend how power moves through the galaxy without armies or laws, without democratic mandate or hereditary claim, we need to go back to before the Spectres existed, before the Turians joined, before the Council was even a concept. We need to go back 2,683 years, to the day the Asari found something in the depths of space that would change the galaxy forever. The foundation: building a galactic government. The Citadel was old when the Asari found it, ancient beyond their ability to measure. Its creators, whoever they truly were, had vanished millennia before, leaving behind only this colossal station and the enigmatic keepers who maintained it in eternal silence. The Asari were the first to discover it, guided by mass relays they'd been following outward from their homeworld of Thessia. When their ships emerged into the system and sensors registered the structure waiting there, every crew member stopped breathing for a moment. The Citadel sprawled across their view screens like nothing their architects had ever imagined. Artificial yet organic in its curves. Incomprehensibly massive yet somehow inviting. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was perfect. They named the year of its discovery 0 on what would become the galactic standard calendar, marking it as the beginning of a new age for their species. The Asari had been spacefaring for centuries by this point, had established colonies, and built a network of worlds connected by mass relay travel. But the Citadel was different from anything they'd encountered. It wasn't just large. It was functional, maintained, waiting. The keepers moved through its corridors and chambers, these insectoid beings who ignored all attempts at communication, but who kept every system operational, who repaired damage and cleaned surfaces, and ensured that environmental controls maintained perfect conditions throughout the station. The Asari had always been a diplomatic people, patient where others might be aggressive, preferring negotiation to conflict, seeking long-term stability over short-term gain. These traits, ingrained in their culture by the long lifespan of their species and the philosophical traditions of their matriarchs, would shape everything that followed. When the Solarians arrived at the Citadel just decades later, also following the relay network, the Asari didn't try to claim sole ownership. They didn't establish military dominance or demand tribute. Instead, they suggested partnership. The Solarians, brilliant and quick-thinking where the Asari were contemplative, saw the logic immediately. Alone, either species would spend centuries fully exploring and understanding the Citadel. Together, they could begin using it as intended, as a hub, a meeting place, a capital for something that didn't yet exist, but that both species could envision: a galactic community, a unified space where species could interact, trade, resolve disputes without warfare. The Asari brought their diplomatic tradition and long-term thinking. The Solarians brought their intelligence networks, their ability to gather and process information at speeds that left other species baffled. Together, they formed the first council in the year that would be designated 500 BCE by human reckoning. The early council was modest in its ambitions. The Asari and Solarians focused on establishing basic principles, creating frameworks for interaction between species that might have vastly different biology, psychology, and cultural norms. They developed the concept of associate membership, allowing species to maintain embassies on the Citadel without full council representation, binding them to basic accords without demanding they surrender sovereignty. This was brilliant in its simplicity. Species could join the galactic community gradually, could benefit from trade and protection while maintaining independence, could prove their value and stability over decades or centuries before being considered for full membership. The Volus were among the first to recognize the opportunity. These small, stocky beings who lived in pressure suits designed for their high-gravity ammonia atmosphere homeworld weren't warriors or explorers. They were traders, economists, masters of financial systems and resource management. In 200 BCE, the council granted them an embassy in recognition of their contributions to Citadel space, particularly their Unified Banking Act, which established the credit as standard currency across all associate members. This decision demonstrated the Council's understanding of power's many forms. Military strength mattered, certainly, but economic integration created dependencies that were often more binding than any treaty. Over the next centuries, more species found their way to the Citadel. The Batarians, eventually. The Elcor, with their gravitationally influenced communication style. The Hanar, those bioluminescent jellyfish beings who spoke with elaborate politeness and viewed the ancient Protheans as divine. The Quarians, before their tragic exodus. Each brought unique perspectives, unique capabilities, unique challenges to the growing community. The Council mediated disputes between them, established protocols for interaction, slowly built a system of governance that worked not through direct control, but through accumulated precedent and mutual benefit. This was the foundation of soft power that would define the Council for millennia. They created value by existing, by providing a neutral ground where conflicts could be resolved without warfare, where trade could flow, protected by mutual defense pacts, where small species could find security through association with larger ones. The Council asked little in return: adherence to basic conventions about warfare, about treatment of other species, about which technologies could be developed and which were too dangerous to pursue. And in exchange, they offered access to the greatest commercial hub in the galaxy, protection under collective defense agreements, and the prestige of being part of something larger than any single species could achieve alone. The Asari and Solarians built this system with patience and care, understanding that true authority comes not from the power to compel, but from the power to convince, to make your interests align with others' interests so thoroughly that they follow your lead without realizing they're being led. For nearly 700 years, this quiet system worked. The Council expanded gradually, incorporating new associate members, mediating disputes, maintaining order through diplomacy and soft influence. They encountered challenges, certainly, but nothing that threatened the fundamental structure they'd created. Then, someone activated the wrong relay, and everything changed. Baptism by fire, the Rachni Wars. The year, according to the galactic standard calendar they'd established, was approximately 1 CE. A Solarian survey team, exploring new systems and cataloging resources as their species had done for centuries, found an inactive mass relay floating in deep space. Standard procedure at the time was to activate any relay discovered, to see where it led, to map the network that the Protheans had left behind, like a gift to younger species. The Solarians followed their protocols. They activated the relay, the connection established, linking to another relay in a system that had been isolated for unknown millennia. And through that connection came the Rachni. Imagine a nightmare made flesh, and then multiplied by billions. The Rachni were insectoid, yes, but that word doesn't capture the horror of them. They moved in swarms that blotted out stars, their ships organic and writhing, their warriors covered in natural armor that could shrug off weapons fire that would drop any other species. They were intelligent, guided by queens who dwelt deep underground, in nests that extended for miles through hostile worlds where temperatures and toxicity would kill any Solarian or Asari within minutes. They communicated through some form of telepathy or chemical signaling that made negotiation impossible. You couldn't speak to a Rachni worker or warrior any more than you could negotiate with your hand to stop punching yourself. The Rachni didn't explore. They didn't trade. They didn't seek diplomatic contact. They expanded, rapidly and relentlessly, using technology reverse-engineered from the captured Solarian ships. Within years, they'd constructed their own FTL vessels. Within decades, they'd conquered multiple systems. The Council races found themselves in an existential fight for survival against an enemy they couldn't communicate with, couldn't understand, couldn't appease or frighten or negotiate with. For nearly a century, the Council lost ground steadily. The Asari were skilled warriors when diplomacy failed, their commando units among the finest special forces in the galaxy. But they couldn't match the Rachni's numbers. The Solarians had intelligence networks and unconventional warfare capabilities, virus deployment and sabotage that slowed the Rachni advance but never stopped it. Other associate members contributed what they could, but the simple truth was that the Rachni had evolved for a hostile environment that killed most species, bred faster than any spacefaring race the Council had encountered, and fought with a coordinated efficiency that came from hive mind thinking no individualistic species could replicate. The war ground on. Worlds fell. Colonies were overrun, their populations slaughtered or driven off. The Council faced the real possibility that they would lose, that this expanding swarm would consume Citadel space entirely, would use their worlds as breeding grounds for even more Rachni, would push outward until they'd consumed every habitable system in the galaxy. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The Council couldn't breed fast enough to replace casualties. The Rachni could. Eventually, inevitably, the numbers would tell. Then, the Solarians found the Krogan. Tuchanka was a world of ash and radiation, a planet that had killed itself in nuclear fire during a global conflict that left the Krogan species living in the ruins of their own civilization. The survivors were tough beyond measure, evolved for a hostile environment that made Rachni worlds look comfortable by comparison. They bred fast, though not as explosively as the Rachni. They were aggressive, warlike, raised in a culture where strength meant survival and weakness meant death. The Solarians looked at them and saw a solution to the Rachni problem. What happened next would be debated by historians and ethicists for the next 2,000 years. The Solarians uplifted the Krogan, gave them advanced technology, and moved them off Tuchanka to better worlds, all under the guise of altruistic first contact. The true purpose emerged quickly enough. The Krogan were needed as soldiers, as expendable troops who could storm Rachni nests where no Asari or Solarian could survive. The Council, desperate and losing, accepted this bargain. The Krogan, eager to prove themselves worthy of their new position among the stars, agreed to fight. The tide turned. The Krogan, immune to environments that would kill other species, able to replace casualties through rapid breeding, could do what the Council races couldn't. They descended into Rachni nests and killed queens. They reclaimed conquered worlds, pushed the Rachni back system by system. It was brutal work, the kind that leaves scars on a species' collective psyche. but the Krogan had been brutalized by Tachanka for thousands of years. They knew how to endure horror. They knew how to fight in hell. In 300 CE, the Rachni were declared extinct. The Krogan fleets had pushed them back to their homeworld of Suen, and then bombarded it until the planet's surface was cratered and broken. Its underground nests collapsed, its queens and workers dead. The Council, which would normally have objected to such total destruction, accepted it as necessary. After 300 years of warfare, after losing countless worlds and billions of lives, complete eradication seemed like the only way to ensure the Rachni never threatened the galaxy again. The victory celebration was heartfelt. The Krogan were hailed as saviors, given new worlds as rewards, honored with monuments on the Citadel itself. But beneath the gratitude, something else was growing. The Council had learned hard lessons about their own vulnerability, about the limits of soft power when faced with an enemy that couldn't be negotiated with. They'd learned that their careful diplomatic system could fail catastrophically when confronted by threats that didn't respect their authority or share their values. The response was institutional. The Council established new policies prohibiting the activation of dormant mass relays leading to uncharted systems. They couldn't afford another Rachni situation, another accidentally awakened threat that could push them to the edge of extinction. They also began thinking differently about power projection, about the need for capabilities beyond diplomacy and economic leverage. They needed tools for problems that couldn't be solved with treaties and trade agreements. But the most immediate problem was the Krogan themselves. The species that had saved the galaxy was about to become its next great threat. The Krogan question, from heroes to threat. The Krogan had been given worlds as payment for their service during the Rachni Wars. Pristine colonies free from the radiation and toxicity that had defined their existence on Tachanka. And in those better conditions, with abundant resources and no longer locked in constant warfare with their own species, the Krogan did what evolution had programmed them to do. They bred explosively. The Krogan female could lay clutches of 1,000 eggs at once, and before the genophage, most of those eggs would develop successfully. In their natural environment on Tachanka, this high fertility was offset by high mortality. Predators, disease, radiation, and constant clan warfare kept the population in balance. But on their new worlds, with council medicine and technology, with peace and plenty, those limiting factors disappeared. The Krogan population didn't just grow, it exploded. Within a generation, the Krogan had filled their reward worlds to capacity. They needed more space, more resources to feed their expanding numbers. They began colonizing nearby systems, establishing outposts without seeking council approval. This expansion brought them into territory that other species considered theirs, including established Asari colonies. The Council, recognizing the potential for conflict, asked the Krogan to withdraw from certain worlds, to negotiate boundaries, to participate in the careful diplomatic dance that kept peace in Citadel space. The Krogan refused. They'd earned those worlds with blood during the Rachni Wars. They needed those resources to support their people. Who were the Asari or Solarians to tell them where they could and couldn't settle? The resentment that had been building since the wars ended spilled over into open defiance. The Krogan hadn't fought and died for the Council only to be told they needed permission to expand. They'd proven themselves the greatest warriors in the galaxy. Now they would take what they needed. Around 700 CE, the Krogan rebellions began. The Council initially tried diplomatic solutions, offered compromises, suggested alternative colony sites, but the Krogan weren't interested in negotiation. They'd learned from the Council itself that military power could solve problems that diplomacy couldn't. They'd learned from the Rachni Wars that overwhelming force, applied ruthlessly, could conquer anything. Now they would prove they'd learned those lessons well. The Council found itself facing the same challenge it had faced with the Rachni, but worse in some ways. The Krogan weren't mindless swarms. They were intelligent, capable of strategy and tactics, equipped with advanced technology the Council had given them. They understood Citadel Space's infrastructure and defenses because they'd helped build and defend it, and they were angry, driven by a sense of betrayal, by the feeling that they'd been used during the wars and discarded once their usefulness ended. The Asari and Solarians mobilized their military forces, but the math was familiar and terrifying. The Krogan could replace casualties faster than the Council races could. In a war of attrition, the species with the highest birth rate wins. The Council was losing. Again. Facing another existential threat from a species they'd helped create. In 693 CE, at the height of the crisis, the Council made two critical decisions that would define their approach to power projection for the next 2,000 years. First, they created the Spectres. The origins of the Special Tactics and Reconnaissance Division lay in the Solarian Special Tasks Group, those elite operatives who'd conducted intelligence gathering and sabotage operations since long before the Council formed. The STG worked outside normal military chains of command, conducted operations that regular soldiers couldn't or wouldn't, used methods that made conventional officers uncomfortable. They were effective precisely because they weren't bound by the rules that governed everyone else. The Council recognized that they needed something similar, a force that could act decisively without the bureaucratic constraints that slowed conventional military response. More importantly, they needed operatives who could handle problems before they became wars, who could identify threats early and eliminate them with surgical precision. The Rachni Wars had proven that once a full-scale conflict began, even victory came at enormous cost. Better to prevent such conflicts entirely. The first Spectre was Bilo Gurgi, a Solarian STG operative who'd been imprisoned after an assassination mission went badly. Gurgi had used 30 hostages as bait to lure his target into the open, then killed everyone, hostages included, to ensure mission success. It was ruthless, illegal, morally reprehensible by conventional standards. The Council looked at what Gurgi had done and saw exactly what they needed. Gurgi was offered amnesty in exchange for becoming something new. He would answer only to the Council, would be bound by no law except theirs, would have authority to preserve galactic stability by any means necessary. He accepted. The Office of Special Tactics and Reconnaissance was born. Other operatives followed, drawn from the finest Asari huntresses and Solarian STG agents, individuals who'd proven themselves capable of extraordinary violence in service of peace. The Spectres operated in secret initially, conducting guerrilla operations against Krogan infrastructure. They deployed viruses that crashed planetary networks. They sabotaged fuel refineries and supply depots. They assassinated key military leaders, spreading paranoia and disrupting command structures. The Krogan knew someone was striking at them, but couldn't identify who or how to retaliate. This invisible enemy sapped their momentum, forced them to divert resources to security, slowed their advance while the Council prepared its second major move. In the midst of the rebellions, the Council made first contact with a new species, the Turians. The Turians were militaristic by culture and biology, a people who valued discipline and hierarchy above all else, who believed that military service was every citizen's duty, and that individual sacrifice for the collective good was the highest virtue. They'd built one of the largest and most capable military forces in their region of space. They'd never heard of the Council or the Rachni Wars. They knew nothing of the careful diplomatic system the Asari and Solarians had built. The Council explained the situation. The Krogan, once heroes, had turned against the very civilization they'd saved. They were expanding through force, taking worlds that belonged to others, threatening to destabilize the entire region. Would the Turians consider joining the war effort? The Turians assessed the Krogan and concluded they represented a legitimate threat not just to the Council, but to galactic stability generally. They agreed to intervene. When the Turian fleets engaged the Krogan, the character of the war changed immediately. The Turians brought discipline and coordination that the Krogan's individual clan-based warfare couldn't match. They brought military experience refined over centuries of internal peacekeeping. They brought, most importantly, the willingness to do whatever was necessary to win. The Krogan responded to the Turian offensive by deploying weapons of mass destruction against Turian colonies, rendering entire worlds uninhabitable. It was a reminder of their Tuchanka origins, of a species that had once destroyed its own planet, and apparently hadn't learned from that mistake. The Turians looked at the devastation and made a cold calculation. As long as the Krogan could breed fast enough to replace their soldiers, this war would continue indefinitely. The only way to truly end the threat was to eliminate the Krogan's fundamental advantage, their fertility. The Solarians had already developed a biological weapon for exactly this purpose, the genophage. It was intended as a deterrent, a threat to force Krogan compliance. The Turians had no interest in deterrence. They deployed the genophage across Krogan space, using the Solarian-provided distribution mechanism to ensure thorough coverage. The weapon didn't kill. It didn't sterilize completely, but it dramatically reduced Krogan fertility, making successful births rare enough that population growth became impossible. The Krogan fought on even as their numbers dwindled, but the mathematics had shifted. They couldn't replace their casualties anymore. Every battle became one of attrition they would inevitably lose. Eventually, the rebellions ended, not with treaties, but with exhaustion. The Krogan, withdrawing to their remaining worlds, defeated and bitter. In 900 CE, in recognition of their crucial role in ending the conflict, the Turians were granted the third seat on the Citadel Council. The triumvirate was complete. The Asari brought diplomacy and long-term thinking. The Solarians brought intelligence and information networks. The Turians brought military strength and the willingness to enforce council decisions with force when necessary. Together, they formed a government structure that could handle threats through escalating responses, from diplomatic pressure to covert action to open warfare, each tool wielded by the species best suited to it. The Krogan rebellions had taught the Council lessons they would never forget. Soft power had limits. Diplomacy required the implicit threat of force behind it. And sometimes, to preserve galactic stability, you needed people willing to make terrible decisions and live with the consequences. The Spectres, their existence and activities now public knowledge after the rebellions, would be essential to this new understanding of how power must sometimes operate. If you ask citizens of Citadel space about the Spectres, you'll get different answers depending on who's speaking. The young Hanar on the Presidium speaks of them with reverence, these sacred protectors who maintain order across the stars. The Krogan mercenary in the wards spits at the mention, calls them council assassins hiding behind official sanction. The Asari shopkeeper shrugs, says they're mostly myth, that she's lived 300 years without ever seeing one. The CSEC officer's eyes harden, voice dropping to barely controlled anger as she describes how a Spectre walked through her active crime scene, contaminated evidence, interrogated her suspect with methods that would get any officer fired and prosecuted, then departed with no explanation and no accountability. All of these perspectives contain truth. The Spectres are many things simultaneously. Elite operatives and sanctioned killers, heroes and necessary evils, symbols of galactic unity and embodiments of everything wrong with unchecked power. They exist in a space beyond law, granted authority that supersedes every legal code in council space, while being bound by none of them. They are the council's will made manifest, operating where diplomacy fails and conventional military force would be excessive or impractical. The selection process for becoming a Spectre is deliberately obscured. There's no application form, no test you can take, no training program to graduate from. The Council observes. They watch promising individuals, track careers that demonstrate exceptional capability and moral flexibility. A Turian officer who achieves victory through tactics that regular military command finds too ruthless might draw attention. An Asari huntress who completes impossible missions with methods that disturb her superiors becomes a candidate. A Solarian STG operative whose success rate vastly exceeds their peers earns consideration. The observation can last years. The candidate might have no idea they're being watched, might go about their career assuming they're just another soldier or agent. Then one day, they receive an invitation, not to interview for a position, not to compete for selection. The invitation is the selection. Come to the Citadel, meet with the council, become a Spectre, or decline and return to your previous life knowing you were deemed worthy of the galaxy's highest operational authority. Most accept. How could you not? To be chosen as a Spectre means being recognized as exceptional by the civilization's highest authority. It means being granted power that even admirals and generals don't possess. It means operating free from the constraints that hobble every other operative in the galaxy. It means your judgment, your conscience, your assessment of what's necessary becomes the only law that binds you. And that's precisely what makes the Spectres so dangerous and so valuable simultaneously. Consider what a Spectre can do. They can walk into any facility in council space and demand access, can override local security, can commandeer equipment and personnel for their operations. They can conduct investigations into anyone, from corporate executives to planetary governments, without warrants or oversight. They can kill without trial, without evidence presented in court, without anything except their own determination that the killing serves galactic stability. There's no uniform, no standard equipment, no central command structure. Each Spectre operates independently, receiving missions directly from the Council, or often identifying problems themselves and taking initiative to resolve them. Some, like Nihilus Kriek, operated as peacekeepers, using their authority to negotiate settlements and prevent conflicts from escalating. Others, like Saren Arterius, were more comfortable with assassination and destruction, viewing their role as eliminating threats before they became crises. The Council prefers this diversity of approach. Different problems require different solutions, and a force composed entirely of diplomatic peacekeepers or ruthless assassins would be limited. By selecting Spectres with varied temperaments and methods, by granting them autonomy to operate according to their own judgment, the Council created a flexible tool that could handle any situation. But flexibility comes at a cost. The Spectres answer only to the Council, which means local authorities have no recourse when a Spectre's methods cross ethical lines. CSEC, the Citadel's security force, has standing orders not to interfere with Spectre operations. Planetary governments must cooperate with Spectre demands, even when those demands violate local law. The message is clear. Galactic stability trumps local sovereignty. Council authority supersedes all others, and the specters are the manifestation of that hierarchy. This creates obvious potential for abuse. What prevents a specter from using their authority for personal gain, from settling private scores under the guise of official operations, from becoming precisely the kind of lawless threat they're supposed to prevent? The answer is disturbingly simple. Nothing, really, except the selection process and the implicit threat that another specter will be sent to deal with rogues. The Council's gamble is that individuals capable of becoming specters possess judgment sophisticated enough to handle power without being corrupted by it. Sometimes this gamble fails. Saren Arterius, one of the most accomplished specters in the organization's history, went rogue in the most spectacular way possible, becoming the vanguard for a Reaper invasion. But Saren's failure, while catastrophic, also demonstrated the system's self-correcting mechanism. Commander Shepard, the first human specter, was granted authority specifically to stop Saren. When a specter becomes the problem, the solution is another specter. The Council maintains this system because the alternatives are worse. Without specters, how would they handle situations requiring immediate action across vast distances? Conventional military deployment takes time, involves bureaucratic approval processes, makes public situations that benefit from discretion. Intelligence services like the Solarian STG are effective but operate under their government's authority, answerable to specific species' interests rather than galactic stability. The Spectres, answering only to the Council and operating with complete autonomy, can respond to emerging threats faster than any conventional force. They can conduct operations that regular military or intelligence services legally can't. They can make decisions in real time based on classified information that can't be shared with local authorities. They are, in essence, the Council's acknowledgement that sometimes governance requires someone to break the rules in service of larger goals. This creates a curious relationship with the rest of Citadel society. Most citizens view specters as distant legends, figures who might intervene in planetary politics or major crimes but who have no impact on daily life. Law enforcement officers view them with mixed feelings, appreciating the backup in major cases while resenting the lack of accountability. Criminals, particularly organized crime leaders and terrorists, view them with genuine fear. A criminal can hide from CSEC, can bribe local officials, can operate in jurisdictions where regular law enforcement has no authority. But a specter can follow you anywhere, can kill you on suspicion alone, and no one will question whether the elimination was justified. The psychological impact of the specters extends far beyond their actual operations. The knowledge that they exist, that they might be investigating you right now, that crossing certain lines might bring a visit from someone authorized to end you without trial, acts as a deterrent to behavior the Council wants to discourage. It's a form of distributed enforcement, where the mere possibility of intervention prevents actions from occurring in the first place. And for all the controversy, for all the ethical concerns and potential for abuse, the Spectres work. In the 2,000 years since their founding, they've prevented countless conflicts, eliminated threats before they could destabilize regions, gathered intelligence that allowed the Council to act preventively rather than reactively. The system's effectiveness has justified its existence, at least from the Council's perspective. The species who protest Spectre authority most loudly are often the same ones who call for Spectre intervention when threats emerge that affect them directly. By the time humanity arrived on the galactic stage, the Spectres had become an accepted, if controversial, institution. There were approximately 100 active Spectres at any given time, drawn from multiple species, each operating independently across Citadel space. They'd handled everything from terrorist cells to rogue military units, from corporate conspiracies to pirate fleets. They'd accumulated centuries of operational success and a reputation that made their name alone carry weight. What nobody expected was how quickly humanity would disrupt this carefully balanced system, or how the arrival of this aggressive, ambitious new species would test every assumption the Council had made about power and its projection across the galaxy. Humanity arrival, disrupting the status quo. The humans came through Relay 314 in the year 2157, moving fast and confident, activating dormant relays without understanding the prohibition against such actions, exploring aggressively in a way that made Council observers nervous. They'd discovered the Prothean ruins on Mars, reverse-engineered Mass Effect technology in a handful of decades, and launched themselves into space with the aggressive enthusiasm of a species that had never learned caution. They were expanding, colonizing, pushing outward with a speed that reminded Council historians uncomfortably of the Krogan, though at least the humans didn't breed quite as explosively. When human ships encountered a Turian patrol enforcing the relay activation prohibition, neither side understood what they'd stumbled into. The humans didn't know about the Council, about the laws governing relay use, about the Rachni wars that had created those prohibitions. The Turians saw a species breaking fundamental galactic law and responded as their culture and training demanded, with immediate military force to prevent potential catastrophe. What followed was brief, brutal, and transformative. The First Contact War, which humans would remember as the moment they learned they weren't alone, was barely a skirmish by galactic standards. A single Turian fleet engaged human forces around Shang-Chi, humanity's most distant colony. The Turians, accustomed to overwhelming opposition with superior firepower and discipline, expected quick capitulation. Instead, they found humans who fought with desperate ferocity, who adapted tactics rapidly, who refused to surrender even when clearly outmatched. The Turians took Shang-Chi after 3 months of fighting. Then, to their surprise, a human fleet appeared. Reinforcements marshaled faster than Turian intelligence had predicted possible. The subsequent battle went poorly for the Turians, not because human technology was superior, but because human tactics were unpredictable, aggressive in ways that violated Turian military doctrine. The human commander, Admiral Castania Drescher, employed strategies that Turian officers found reckless to the point of insanity, risking casualties that no Turian commander would accept to achieve objectives that seemed purely psychological rather than strategic. It worked. The human fleet retook Shang-Chi, and the Turians found themselves reassessing what they'd assumed would be a minor police action. These humans fought like Krogan, but thought like Solarians, combining aggression with adaptability in ways that didn't match any species profile the Council had encountered. More concerning, humanity's response to first contact violence wasn't fear or supplication. It was mobilization. Human military forces across their space activated, preparing for total war against an enemy they knew nothing about. The Council intervened before the situation escalated further. This was precisely the kind of conflict the Council existed to prevent. Two species stumbling into warfare through misunderstanding rather than genuine grievance. The Council mediated, explaining to humanity about galactic law and Citadel space, explaining to the Turians about humanity's ignorance of that law. A peace settlement was negotiated, with humanity agreeing to accept Council authority regarding relay activation, and the Turians withdrawing from human space. In 2165, 8 years after first contact, humanity was granted an embassy on the Citadel. This was standard procedure for new species, the first step toward potential associate membership. What wasn't standard was how quickly humans began pushing for more. Most species spent decades or centuries at the embassy level, proving their stability, demonstrating they could contribute to Citadel space before seeking greater involvement. Humanity immediately began campaigning for a council seat. They had territory, they argued. They had military strength demonstrated during the First Contact War. They had economic power from their rapid expansion. They had diplomatic capabilities. Why should they wait generations when they met every practical criterion for Council membership? The Council's refusal was diplomatic but firm. Humanity was too new, too aggressive, too unpredictable. The Council seats weren't just about capability. They were about trust, built over centuries, about proving long-term commitment to galactic stability over short-term advantage. The Asari had waited millennia between discovering the Citadel and forming the Council. The Turians had fought the Krogan rebellions to prove their value. Humanity couldn't expect to leap past all that through sheer impatience. But humanity didn't accept the refusal gracefully. They continued pushing, using every diplomatic tool they possessed. They formed alliances with other embassy species who also sought greater representation. They contributed military forces to peacekeeping operations, demonstrating their willingness to support Council interests. They integrated their economy into the credit system so thoroughly that disrupting human trade would damage the entire network. They made themselves valuable, necessary, impossible to ignore. And they pursued another path to influence: the Spectres. Having one of your species become a Spectre was significant beyond the individual's authority. It represented Council acknowledgement of your species' capabilities, trust in your judgment, implicit recognition that you belonged among the galactic elite. Several human candidates emerged over the years, talented N7 operatives from the Alliance military's Special Forces program. The most promising was David Anderson, a decorated officer with a record that matched any candidate from established council species. In 2183, Anderson was given a mission that was effectively his Spectre evaluation. He was to work with Saren Arterius, one of the most accomplished Turian Spectres, on an operation to investigate weapons development by a human corporation. The mission went catastrophically wrong. The facility was destroyed, key evidence lost, and Anderson's report claimed Saren had sabotaged the operation, perhaps to prevent a human from becoming a Spectre. The council investigated, but without clear evidence, they sided with Saren. The Turian Spectre had decades of exemplary service. Anderson was a newcomer making extraordinary accusations. The human's candidacy was rejected, and with it, humanity's best chance at Spectre representation seemed to evaporate. It would be years before the truth emerged. Saren had indeed sabotaged Anderson, had deliberately destroyed his candidacy, though the reasons went far deeper than simple species prejudice. Humanity's frustration grew. They'd done everything right, followed every protocol, contributed to Citadel's certification and prosperity, yet they remained at the periphery of power. They had an embassy, not a council seat. They had candidates, not Spectres. They were participants in the system, but not shapers of it. The council's patience with humanity's impatience began wearing thin. The humans complained about the pace of their advancement, while being unwilling to wait the centuries that other species had waited. Then, in 2183, Commander Shepard changed everything. Shepard had been part of Anderson's operation years earlier, had witnessed what happened on that mission. When a new opportunity arose, when the human needed a Spectre candidate to investigate a Geth attack on a human colony, Anderson recommended Shepard. The Council, pressured by the need to maintain good relations with humanity and recognizing Shepard's capabilities, agreed to an evaluation period. Shepard would work with Nihilus Kriak, a Turian Spectre known for his integrity, on an operation to investigate the Geth presence. On Eden Prime, everything went wrong again. The Geth attack was more extensive than intelligence suggested. Nihilus was killed, and Shepard encountered something that would force the Council to confront a threat they'd spent decades dismissing: the Reapers. The evidence Shepard brought back was disturbing. A vision from a Prothean beacon showing machines harvesting organic life. Testimony from a traumatized dock worker who'd seen her colleagues transformed by synthetic creatures. A connection to Saren, who'd been present at Eden Prime and had apparently allied himself with the Geth. Most damning, a recording of Saren discussing the return of the Reapers, ancient machines that supposedly wiped out the Protheans and now threatened to repeat the cycle. The Council listened to Shepard's report with the patience of leaders who'd heard thousands of threat assessments over centuries. The Reapers were myth, they explained. The Protheans had vanished 50,000 years ago, likely through conventional civilization collapse, not extermination by synthetic gods. The evidence was circumstantial. The beacon's vision could be interpreted many ways. The connection to Saren was concerning, but didn't prove a galactic-scale threat. What the Council did acknowledge was that Saren had clearly gone rogue, had allied with the Geth, had attacked a human colony without authorization. This was enough to revoke his Spectre status, to declare him a fugitive. And to hunt a rogue Spectre, you needed another Spectre. Shepard was inducted into the Spectres, becoming the first human to achieve what Anderson had been denied. The political calculation was transparent. By granting Shepard Spectre status, the Council addressed multiple objectives simultaneously. They gave humanity the representation it had demanded. They created a legal framework for pursuing Saren. They demonstrated their willingness to act on human concerns. And they did all this while avoiding the larger commitment of a council seat, while maintaining plausible deniability about the Reaper threat that they didn't want to acknowledge. Shepard hunted Saren across the galaxy, uncovering evidence that the Council preferred to ignore. The Reapers were real. They'd created the mass relay network, and the Citadel itself had left them as traps for organic civilizations to develop around. Every cycle they returned to harvest the advanced species, to prevent organic life from threatening their existence. The Protheans hadn't collapsed naturally. They'd been systematically exterminated, and now the current cycle's turn had come. The Council heard Shepard's reports and made what they believed were reasonable political decisions. The evidence was extraordinary, the claims unprecedented. To accept the Reaper threat as real would require mobilizing every species in Citadel space for a war against an enemy that might not exist, might not arrive for decades or centuries, might be exaggerated threat based on incomplete information. The political cost of such mobilization, the economic disruption, the panic it would cause among civilian populations. All of this had to be weighed against evidence that remained, from their perspective, ambiguous. So the Council focused on what they could verify: Saren's betrayal, the Geth threat, the need to prevent immediate crises. They authorized Shepard to continue the hunt, but declined to prepare for Reaper invasion. This was governance as they'd practiced it for millennia, dealing with proven threats while avoiding panic over theoretical ones. Then Sovereign arrived at the Citadel and theory became reality in the most violent way possible. The Reaper Vanguard attacked the station directly, bringing a Geth fleet through a relay that connected straight to the Citadel's heart. Saren, indoctrinated and controlled by Sovereign, led the assault personally. The station's defenses, formidable as they were, couldn't stop a Reaper. The Council fleet, caught unprepared, fought desperately to prevent the Citadel's fall. The Asari, Solarian, and Turian ships threw themselves at Sovereign, buying time with their lives. Commander Shepard, arriving with a human fleet at a moment when every second mattered, saved the Council. The exact details of the battle remain classified, but the outcome was clear. Sovereign was destroyed. Saren was dead. The Citadel survived. And the Council owed their lives to humanity, specifically to the Spectre they'd reluctantly inducted, and the fleet that had arrived when called. In the aftermath, as the Citadel burned and casualties mounted into the thousands, the Council faced a decision that would define their relationship with humanity for the coming years. The entire Council had nearly died. Their positions needed to be filled. at least temporarily. Humanity had proven itself in the most dramatic way possible, had saved not just the Council, but galactic civilization itself from a threat the Council hadn't believed existed. The question was simple and loaded with implications. Should humanity receive a Council seat? The debate was brief but intense. Some argued humanity had earned it, that their sacrifice and effectiveness demonstrated they belonged at the highest level of galactic governance. Others argued that granting a Council seat as reward for military action set dangerous precedent, that it suggested power came from violence rather than the careful diplomacy the Council represented. Commander Shepard, asked to weigh in on the decision, could recommend either expanding the Council to include humanity or maintaining the status quo while allowing humanity to select which existing counselor species would be restored first. The choice was political theater of the highest order, a test of human priorities and long-term thinking. If Shepard chose to push for a human council seat, it demonstrated humanity's ambition, but also their willingness to capitalize on crisis for political gain. If Shepard chose to restore the existing council, it demonstrated restraint and respect for established order, earning political capital through deference rather than demanding recognition. Either way, the Council's relationship with humanity had fundamentally changed. Humans had proven themselves capable of operating at the highest levels of galactic security. They had a Spectre now, a voice that carried Council authority. They demonstrated military capability that even the Turians respected. And they'd done all of this in less than 30 years since first contact, a pace that made every other species' development look glacial by comparison. The Council would spend the next years trying to integrate humanity into existing power structures, while preventing them from disrupting the careful balance that had maintained peace for millennia. It was becoming clear that the old system, designed for species that thought in terms of centuries and accepted gradual change, struggled to accommodate a species that thought in decades and demanded immediate results. Humanity wasn't just another associate member seeking embassy status. They were a disruptive force that challenged fundamental assumptions about how galactic power should be distributed and wielded. And the Council, for all their centuries of experience and accumulated wisdom, had no clear playbook for handling a species that refused to wait their turn. The mechanics of soft power. To understand how the Council actually governs without legal authority over sovereign species, without standing armies under their direct command, without the ability to compel obedience through force, you need to understand the mechanisms of soft power at scales that dwarf anything Earth's nations ever developed. The Council's influence operates through networks so extensive and subtle that most citizens never recognize how thoroughly they're shaped by Council preferences. Consider the credit, the standard currency across Citadel space. Technically, the credit was established by the Volnus Unified Banking Act centuries before as a convenience for interstellar trade. Any species could theoretically maintain their own currency for internal use. But in practice, economic integration into the credit system is so complete that operating outside it means isolation from galactic markets. Want to buy drive cores manufactured by the Asari? You need credits. Want to sell agricultural products to colonies across Citadel space? They pay in credits. Want to access medical technology, entertainment, media, raw materials from a dozen different species? Credits. The Council doesn't control the credit directly. They don't set exchange rates or monetary policy in the way Earth's central banks might, but they heavily influence the institutions that do, particularly the volus banking conglomerates that manage most interstellar financial transactions. When the Council wants to pressure a species or colony, they don't send warships. They quietly communicate concerns to the banking institutions, which then adjust lending rates, credit availability, investment priorities. Suddenly, that troublesome colony finds itself unable to secure loans for infrastructure development. That aggressive species discovers that trade partners are demanding higher insurance rates for dealing with them. The beauty of economic pressure is its deniability. The Council can claim they took no action, that market forces simply responded to risk assessments. The targeted government can't prove coordination between Council and banks, can't demonstrate that their economic difficulties stem from political punishment rather than legitimate financial concerns. And even if they could prove it, what would they do? Leave the credit system entirely, isolating themselves from galactic commerce? The cure would be worse than the disease. Military power operates similarly through indirection. The Council maintains no unified military under their direct command. The Asari republics, the Solarian Union, and the Turian hierarchy each control their own fleets, answer to their own governments, make their own strategic decisions. But these three species coordinate military activities so thoroughly through joint operations, shared intelligence, and combined training that they function as a unified force when Council interests align. The treaties of Farixon formalized this coordination for capital ship construction, limiting the number of dreadnoughts each species can build. The ratios favor Council species. For every human dreadnought, the Turians can build 5, and the Asari can build 3. This isn't just military advantage, it's political messaging. The treaty says explicitly that some species are more trusted than others, that Council members have different rights than associate members, that acceptance into the upper tiers of galactic governance brings tangible benefits. Species that challenge Council authority find themselves facing not Council fleets, but coordinated responses from multiple members acting in their own interests that happen to align with Council preferences. When the Batarians grew too aggressive in their expansion, enslaving populations and violating colonization treaties, they weren't fought by Council ships. Instead, Asari peacekeeping forces secured refugees. Solarian intelligence operatives supported resistance movements, and Turian patrols enforced no-fly zones. The Council claimed they took no hostile action, that member species were simply responding to humanitarian concerns and security threats. Information control represents perhaps the Council's most sophisticated power mechanism. The Solarian Special Tasks Group operates the galaxy's most extensive intelligence network, gathering information from across Citadel space through methods that range from diplomatic observation to infiltration and surveillance. The STG reports to the Solarian Union technically, but they share intelligence freely with Council leadership. When the Council needs to know what's happening in distant systems, what emerging threats might require attention, what political movements could destabilize regions, the STG provides answers. This intelligence advantage allows the Council to act preventively, to address problems before they become crises. A terrorist cell organizing in the Terminus systems receives a Spectre visit before they conduct their first attack. A colony world moving toward rebellion against its parent government finds Council mediators arriving with compromise proposals before violence erupts. A corporation developing weapons that violate arms treaties discovers their research has been leaked to competitors and regulators before prototypes reach production. The Council doesn't advertise this surveillance, doesn't acknowledge the extent of their information gathering. But everyone knows it happens. Everyone operates with the assumption that the Council probably knows what you're planning, and this knowledge itself shapes behavior. You think twice before challenging Council interests if you suspect they're monitoring your communications, tracking your financial transactions, have agents embedded in your organization. Diplomatic prestige operates as another lever of influence. Being accepted by the Council, having embassy space on the Citadel, being granted associate member status carries enormous social and political weight. For species seeking to establish themselves on the galactic stage, Council recognition validates their legitimacy, signals to other species that you're trustworthy, stable, worth engaging with. Conversely, Council disapproval marks you as problematic, discourages others from forming alliances or trade relationships, isolates you from the networks that bind Citadel space together. The Batarians learned this lesson painfully. When their expansion policies and slavery practices became too egregious to ignore, the Council didn't declare war or impose sanctions officially. They simply closed the Batarian embassy, revoked their associate membership status, and encouraged other species to limit contact. The Batarians found themselves increasingly isolated, their trade declining, their diplomatic overtures ignored, their influence diminishing. Eventually, they withdrew entirely to the Terminus systems, becoming effectively a rogue state, operating outside Council authority. The Council pointed to this outcome as evidence of their system's effectiveness. They'd eliminated a problematic species from Citadel space without firing a shot, without imposing sanctions that might have unified the Batarians in opposition, simply by removing legitimacy and allowing natural consequences to follow. Other species observed this and understood the message. Council acceptance is valuable. Council rejection is catastrophic. And maintaining good standing requires adherence to Council preferences, even when those preferences aren't legally binding. Cultural influence flows through channels that most citizens never consciously recognize. Asari media dominates entertainment across Citadel space, spreading Asari values of diplomacy, long-term thinking, and cultural synthesis. Solarian scientific publications set research agendas, determining which questions get asked and which answers get funded. Turian military doctrine influences how other species organize their armed forces, establishing tactical assumptions and strategic frameworks that align with Turian thinking. The Council doesn't dictate these cultural flows, but they don't need to. The Council species have institutional advantages, resource advantages, prestige advantages that make their cultural products dominant. Smaller species absorb these influences without realizing they're being shaped, adopting Council species' values and perspectives as universal norms rather than specific cultural preferences. This is soft power at its most effective, influence so subtle and pervasive that the influenced don't recognize it as influence at all. You think you're making free choices about what media to consume, what research to pursue, what political positions to support. But your options have been shaped by systems designed to make certain choices seem natural, obvious, inevitable. The Council doesn't force you to align with their interests. They construct environments where alignment emerges organically from your own decision-making. The cumulative effect of these mechanisms creates governance without government, authority without sovereignty. The Council suggests rather than commands, influences rather than controls, creates incentives rather than imposing mandates. And species across Citadel space follow Council leadership not because they must, but because their interests have been shaped to align with Council interests. Because the costs of opposition outweigh the benefits. Because the system has been constructed so carefully over millennia that working within it seems like the only rational choice. This is how the Council has maintained order across species lines, across vast distances, across cultures that might seem incompatible. Not through the crude application of force, but through the sophisticated orchestration of incentives, penalties, information, prestige, and cultural influence. It's a masterpiece of political engineering, a system that would make Machiavelli weep with admiration. It's also fragile in ways the Council didn't fully appreciate until they faced threats their soft power couldn't address. Challenges to authority. The Council's carefully constructed system of influence and soft power operated effectively for over 2,000 years, maintaining stability across dozens of species and thousands of star systems. But systems designed for managing conventional political conflicts struggle when confronted with threats that don't care about diplomatic pressure, economic incentives, or social prestige. The Council faced 3 such challenges in rapid succession, each exposing different vulnerabilities in their approach to governance. The first challenge was Commander Shepard and the Reaper threat. Shepard arrived at the Council with evidence of an existential threat to all organic life in the galaxy. The claims were extraordinary. Ancient machines that harvested advanced civilizations in cycles spanning 50,000 years. That the Protheans hadn't collapsed naturally, but had been systematically exterminated. That the entire mass relay network was a trap, designed to guide civilizations down predictable development paths that made them easier to harvest. Shepard had evidence from Prothean beacons, testimony from witnesses, recordings of Saren discussing Reaper return, even fragments of data recovered from Geth archives. The Council listened and made what they believed was a rational political decision. They couldn't mobilize the entire galaxy based on incomplete evidence of a threat that might not materialize for decades or centuries. The political cost would be enormous, the economic disruption catastrophic, the panic among civilian populations unmanageable. They'd spent centuries building a system based on careful deliberation and measured response. Shepard was asking them to abandon that approach for immediate, total war preparation against an enemy that might be mythological. So the Council acknowledged the threat as theoretical possibility, while declining to treat it as imminent reality. They authorized Shepard to investigate further, to pursue Saren, to gather more evidence, but they wouldn't commit galactic resources to Reaper preparation. This was governance as they'd always practiced it: cautious, evidence-based, politically calculated. Shepard found this response inadequate to the point of criminality. The Reapers were real, were coming, would exterminate everyone if preparation didn't begin immediately. Every delay meant more vulnerability, more casualties when the invasion inevitably arrived. The Council's caution looked like cowardice or willful blindness, a refusal to act on clear evidence because action would be politically inconvenient. This conflict exposed a fundamental limitation of Council authority. Their power derived from species choosing to follow their leadership, from the perception that Council decisions were wise and worth respecting. But when a Spectre acting under Council authority disagreed with Council assessment, when that Spectre claimed the Council was wrong about an existential threat, the contradiction undermined their authority structurally. Shepard couldn't compel the Council to act, despite Spectre status, despite saving the Council's lives, despite presenting evidence that would later prove accurate. Shepard couldn't force preparation for Reaper invasion. The Council's response was to suggest Shepard was experiencing trauma-induced paranoia, that the stress of combat and exposure to Prothean technology had distorted judgment, that the Reaper theory was coping mechanism rather than accurate assessment. Then Sovereign attacked the Citadel, and everything the Council had dismissed as paranoid delusion became horrifyingly real. The Battle of the Citadel should have been the Council's vindication moment, the crisis where their system proved its worth. Instead, it revealed how dependent they'd become on advantages they took for granted. The Citadel's defenses, designed to repel conventional attacks from organic fleets, couldn't stop a Reaper. The Council's intelligence networks hadn't detected Sovereign's approach or Saren's infiltration of Citadel systems. The careful diplomatic frameworks meant nothing when faced with an enemy that had no interest in negotiation. The Council survived only because Commander Shepard ignored their caution, pursued the investigation aggressively, and arrived with a human fleet at the critical moment. The galaxy's most powerful government owed their survival to the Spectre they'd been dismissing as paranoid, and the species they'd been treating as impatient newcomers. In the aftermath, the Council faced a credibility crisis. They'd been wrong about the Reapers, wrong about Sed, wrong about Saren, wrong in their assessment of threat levels and appropriate response. Shepard had been right, had tried to warn them, had been ignored. Every species in Citadel space knew this. The Council's reputation for wise judgment, accumulated over millennia, took damage that no amount of diplomatic maneuvering could immediately repair. The Council's response to this challenge was revealing. They acknowledged that Reapers existed, that Sovereign had been real, but they characterized it as an isolated threat, a single Reaper, not the vanguard of a fleet. They suggested the danger had been addressed, that destroying Sovereigns solved the problem. When Shepard insisted the full Reaper fleet was still coming, was trapped in dark space but would find a way to return, the Council grew defensive. They couldn't admit the full scope of their error without undermining the authority their system depended on. They couldn't acknowledge that an existential threat loomed without committing to preparation that would be politically and economically devastating. So they compromised, accepted that Reapers were real, but suggested the immediate threat had passed, urged Shepard to remain vigilant, but declined to mobilize galactic resources for preparation. This middle position satisfied no one. Shepard viewed it as continued denial of obvious reality. Other species saw it as political calculation trumping honest threat assessment. The Council's credibility, already damaged, took further hits as evidence of broader Reaper threat continued accumulating while Council response remained inadequate. Then, 2 years after the Battle of the Citadel, came the second challenge. Human colonies began disappearing. Entire settlements vanished overnight. Populations abducted by unknown forces, leaving no trace except scorch marks and signs of brief but intense fighting. Dozens of colonies, tens of thousands of humans simply gone. The human government appealed to the Council for investigation and protection. The Council, dealing with reconstruction after the Battle of the Citadel and managing numerous other crises, classified the disappearances as low priority. Their reasoning, from a purely political perspective, made sense. The colonies were in the terminus systems outside Council jurisdiction. They'd been established in violation of settlement treaties. The disappearances might be pirate raids or criminal trafficking rather than new existential threat. Committing Council resources to investigate would set precedent that the Council was responsible for protecting illegal colonies anywhere in the galaxy. But to humanity, the Council's response looked like callous disregard for human lives, like evidence that, despite everything, humans still weren't fully accepted as equals in Citadel space. If Asari or Turian colonies were disappearing, would the Council respond with the same bureaucratic indifference? The perception grew that the Council valued human lives less than those of established member species. Commander Shepard, frustrated by Council inaction and dealing with the aftermath of being clinically dead for 2 years, took independent action. Working with Cerberus, a pro-human organization the Council classified as terrorist, Shepard investigated the disappearances and discovered the truth. The Collectors, servants of the Reapers, were abducting humans to construct a new Reaper from harvested genetic material. Shepard gathered a team, traveled through the Omega-4 relay that every previous ship had entered and none had returned from. destroyed the Collector base, and prevented the Reaper creation. This saved potentially millions of human lives. It also created a massive political problem for the Council. A Spectre, acting under Council authority, had worked with a terrorist organization, conducted military operations in the Terminus systems, and destroyed a facility without Council authorization or oversight. Legally, Shepard had violated numerous regulations. Politically, Shepard had undermined Council authority by acting independently when Council chose inaction. That Shepard's actions were justified, that they prevented catastrophe, didn't change the structural problem. A Spectre who ignores Council guidance while still claiming Council authority breaks the system. The Council revoked Shepard's Spectre status, not as punishment but as political necessity. They couldn't maintain authority if Spectres operated independently, couldn't keep the system functional if agents defied their assessments. But this response created new problems. Shepard had been right again, had identified and addressed a threat the Council dismissed. The pattern was becoming undeniable. The Council's careful deliberation looked increasingly like dangerous delay, their political calculation like moral cowardice. The third and final challenge came when the Reapers themselves invaded, and the Council's entire system collapsed under pressure it was never designed to handle. The Reaper invasion began in 2186, with attacks on Earth and other major population centers across the galaxy. This time there was no ambiguity, no room for dismissing the threat as theoretical or exaggerated. Reaper fleets emerged from dark space and began systematically harvesting every advanced species, exactly as Shepard had warned they would. The Council's response demonstrated both the strengths and catastrophic weaknesses of their governance system. They mobilized rapidly, coordinating military response across species, leveraging intelligence networks to track Reaper movements, using diplomatic channels to organize refugee evacuations. The mechanisms they'd built over millennia activated, and the coordination they achieved would have been impossible without their centuries of institutional development. But they also struggled with problems their system had never been designed to address. The Council governed through consensus and careful negotiation. Against the Reapers, such methods were useless. You couldn't negotiate with machines that viewed organic life as raw material. You couldn't find diplomatic solutions with an enemy whose entire purpose was extermination. The Council needed to make rapid military decisions, to commit resources without careful deliberation, to take risks that violated every principle of cautious governance they'd developed. The Council species militaries fought bravely, but coordination proved difficult under crisis conditions. The Turians defended their space fiercely. The Asari protected their homeworld. The Solarians focused on intelligence and unconventional warfare. But unity of effort, the coordinated strategy needed to counter the Reaper invasion effectively, kept fragmenting as each species prioritized their own survival over collective defense. Commander Shepard, Spectre status reinstated out of desperate necessity, worked to unite the galaxy against the Reaper threat. The effort required not just military coordination, but resolving centuries-old conflicts that the Council had managed rather than solved. The Krogan demanded cure for the genophage in exchange for their military support. The Turians resisted, arguing that post-war Krogan expansion would recreate the rebellions. The Quarians wanted help retaking their homeworld from the Geth, even though the Geth represented potential allies against the Reapers. These conflicts exposed how much of the Council's peacekeeping had been surface level, managing symptoms rather than addressing root causes. The Council had contained the Krogan problem without solving it, maintained peace between Quarians and Geth by keeping them separated rather than facilitating reconciliation, preserved stability through careful balance rather than genuine resolution. Shepard, operating with Spectre authority but often contrary to Council preferences, made decisions the Council couldn't or wouldn't make. Shepard cured the genophage, risking potential future Krogan expansion to gain their immediate military support. Shepard brokered peace between Quarians and Geth, achieving in weeks what the Council had claimed impossible for 3 centuries. Shepard united species that the Council had kept separated, building a coalition through personal relationships and desperate necessity. The final battle for Earth demonstrated both the value and limitations of the Council system. The united fleet that assembled represented unprecedented cooperation between species, a level of military coordination that would have been impossible without the Council's centuries of groundwork. But that fleet fought not under Council command, but under Admiral Hackett's, because the Council members were busy defending their own homeworlds, because the threat had overwhelmed their governance capacity. When the Reapers were finally defeated, whether through the Crucible's activation or some other means, the Council survived. But their authority had been fundamentally challenged. They'd been wrong about the Reapers multiple times. They'd failed to prepare adequately despite repeated warnings. They'd proven unable to coordinate effective response to existential threat without a Spectre operating largely independently to force cooperation they couldn't achieve through normal channels. The system that had maintained peace for 2 millennia had nearly failed when tested by enemy it wasn't designed to handle, and everyone knew it. Power in the shadows. The Citadel hangs in space as it has for 50,000 years, its arms stretched wide in permanent embrace, its presidium gleaming under artificial lights that mimic the precise spectrum of an ancient homeworld no living species remembers. The Keepers move through its corridors as they always have, maintaining systems whose purpose even they might not fully understand. In the Council chambers, 3 beings sit in judgment over galactic affairs, as 3 beings have sat for over 2,000 years. The machinery of governance continues. Diplomats negotiate, treaties are signed, and soft power flows through channels carved deep by centuries of careful cultivation. But something has changed in the wake of the Reaper War. The Council's authority, once nearly unquestionable, now carries the weight of their failures alongside their successes. They govern still, their decisions carrying weight across the galaxy. But that weight no longer stems solely from accumulated wisdom and prestige. Now it carries also the memory of warnings ignored, threats dismissed, preparations delayed until almost too late. The Spectres continue their work, operating in the spaces between law and necessity, making decisions that democratic governments can't acknowledge and authoritarian regimes can't trust individuals to make. They hunt criminals across the terminus systems, eliminate threats before they metastasize into crises, gather intelligence that keeps the Council informed about dangers emerging in distant colonies. The system that created them persists because alternatives remain worse, because sometimes governance requires people willing to operate beyond rules while still serving rules' purpose. But the Reaper War revealed truths about this system that can't be unknown. The Council's soft power, so effective at managing conventional political conflicts, proved inadequate against existential threats that didn't respect diplomatic niceties. Their careful deliberation, so valuable for preventing hasty mistakes, became dangerous delay when speed mattered more than certainty. Their distributed authority, so important for maintaining member species autonomy, fragmented into competing priorities when unity was essential. Commander Shepard's role in galactic history illuminates these contradictions. As a Spectre, Shepard theoretically represented Council authority, acted as their will made manifest, enforced their decisions with whatever means necessary. But in practice, Shepard operated against Council preferences repeatedly, making decisions they opposed, pursuing objectives they'd dismissed, building coalitions they'd claimed impossible. Shepard succeeded precisely by ignoring the caution and careful calculation that defined Council governance. This creates a paradox at the heart of how power moves through the galaxy. The Council maintains order through systems designed to prevent rash action, to ensure decisions are carefully considered, to balance competing interests against long-term stability. But when crisis demands rapid, decisive action, when conventional approaches fail and desperate measures become necessary, the Council needs people who will break their own rules, ignore their careful guidance, act on conviction rather than consensus. The Spectres are supposed to be those people, but they're also supposed to remain aligned with Council judgment. What happens when those requirements conflict? When the Council's assessment proves wrong and a Spectre's independent judgment proves right? The system has no good answer. Revoking Spectre status punishes the agent for being correct. Maintaining it despite insubordination undermines Council authority. The contradiction can't be resolved, only managed through selective enforcement and retroactive justification. This fundamental tension between authority and autonomy, between oversight and operational independence, defines the Council's relationship not just with Spectres, but with governance itself. They built a system that works brilliantly for managing the galaxy during normal times, that prevents conflicts from escalating, that maintains stability across vast distances and diverse species. But normal times are defined by the absence of challenges that might break the system. And what happens when abnormal challenges arrive? The Council would argue, and their millennia of success supports the argument, that their system's stability makes it worth maintaining, even knowing its limitations. Yes, they failed to prepare adequately for the Reapers, but they also maintained peace between dozens of species for centuries, prevented countless conflicts, created conditions where civilizations could flourish. The Reaper War was unprecedented, an outlier case that doesn't invalidate the system's effectiveness at handling more conventional challenges. Critics, and post-war there are many, counter that a system that fails during existential crisis has failed at its most important function. What good is maintaining peace for centuries if you can't coordinate effective response when everything is at stake? The Council's soft power, their diplomatic finesse, their centuries of accumulated prestige, all of it nearly proved worthless when tested by enemy that required military coordination rather than political negotiation. The truth, as uncomfortable as it might be, contains elements of both perspectives. The Council system is remarkably effective at what it was designed to do, managing political conflicts between species with competing interests, but shared investment in stability. It's ineffective at handling threats that fall outside its design parameters, that don't respond to economic pressure or diplomatic isolation, that require rapid, decisive action rather than careful deliberation. Understanding this reveals something profound about power itself, about how it must flow differently depending on context. During peacetime, distributed authority and consensus-based decision-making prevent any single species from dominating others, ensure that diverse perspectives shape policy, force consideration of long-term consequences before action. These are features, not bugs, valuable safeguards against the kind of aggressive, unilateral action that creates more problems than it solves. But during crisis, these same features become obstacles. Consensus takes time that emergencies don't permit. Distributed authority fragments when different species prioritize their own survival. Long-term thinking becomes irrelevant when short-term survival is uncertain. The Council system, optimized for peacetime governance, struggles during wartime crisis precisely because the characteristics that make it effective in one context become liabilities in another. The Spectres represent the Council's acknowledgement of this reality, their attempt to create capacity for action that bypasses normal constraints. By granting individuals authority to operate beyond law, to make decisions without consensus, to act rapidly without oversight, the Council tried to build crisis response capability into a system designed for careful deliberation. That this creates tensions and contradictions shouldn't surprise anyone. You can't perfectly reconcile democratic deliberation with autocratic action. Can't fully align consensus-based authority with individual autonomy. What makes the Council system fascinating is that it works anyway, not despite these contradictions, but by managing them pragmatically. The Spectres operate autonomously until their autonomy becomes problematic, then face sanction or revocation. The Council maintains soft power through consensus until crisis demands harder power, then coordinates military response that resembles conventional command structure. The system flexes between modes depending on circumstances, accepting that no single governance approach handles all situations effectively. This flexibility, this willingness to adapt and even contradict their own principles when necessary, might be the Council's greatest strength. They're not ideologically rigid, not committed to any single governance philosophy above practical effectiveness. They'll embrace diplomatic patience when it works, aggressive intervention when necessary, distributed decision-making or centralized command, depending on context. The inconsistency that critics attack is actually pragmatic adaptation to circumstances that demand different approaches. But flexibility has limits, and those limits were tested severely by the Reaper War. The Council adapted, eventually. They reinstated Shepard as Spectre, despite previous revocation. They coordinated military response despite preferring diplomatic solutions. They made rapid decisions despite institutional bias toward deliberation. But these adaptations came slowly, reluctantly, after warnings ignored and opportunities missed. The flexibility that should have been strength became weakness because they adapted too slowly to threats evolving faster than their decision cycles. This suggests that the post-war Council, whatever form it takes, needs modification beyond simply rebuilding what existed before. The system's core approach of soft power and diplomatic influence should remain. These tools remain effective for conventional challenges and shouldn't be abandoned because they proved insufficient for unprecedented crisis. But the system needs better capacity for rapid assessment and response, needs mechanisms for updating threat models faster when evidence accumulates, needs ways to act decisively when waiting for consensus means disaster. The Spectres likely become more central to this evolved system. If the Council's weakness is slow deliberation and Spectre's strength is rapid, autonomous action, then logically the Council should grant Spectres more latitude during potential crisis situations, should trust their field assessment more readily, should be willing to act on Spectre reports without demanding the level of evidence that peacetime governance requires. This means accepting more risk of false positives, of resources committed to threats that might not materialize. But the alternative, waiting for absolute certainty before acting, nearly cost the galaxy everything. Humanity's role in this evolution seems significant. Human culture, human decision-making, human approaches to governance all trend toward faster action, higher risk tolerance, shorter time horizons than the Council species typically embrace. These characteristics made humanity seem reckless and impatient when they first arrived. But those same characteristics, channeled appropriately, might provide exactly what the Council system needs: capacity for rapid response, willingness to act on incomplete information, comfort with uncertainty that the Council's careful deliberation was designed to minimize. This doesn't mean humanity should dominate galactic governance. Their approach has weaknesses that balance their strengths. tendency toward aggressive action that creates problems, short-term thinking that misses consequences, comfort with risk that sometimes manifests as genuine recklessness. The ideal system would blend human capacity for rapid action with a sorry long-term wisdom, human risk tolerance with Solarian intelligence analysis, human adaptability with Turian discipline. Whether such synthesis emerges remains uncertain. The Council rebuilt after the Reaper War, the galaxy slowly recovering, scars healing while memories remain raw. The species that fought together against extinction now face the challenge of building peace together, of creating governance structures that maintain hard-won unity without suppressing legitimate diversity of interest and approach. The Citadel endures as meeting place for this ongoing negotiation, its ancient arms embracing countless beings who gather to argue and trade and live together despite vast differences. The Council sits in their chambers, making decisions that ripple across the galaxy, wielding power that flows through channels both visible and hidden. The Spectres move through shadows, enforcing laws they transcend, serving authority that grants them autonomy, embodying the contradictions at the heart of how power must sometimes operate. This system, imperfect and tested nearly to breaking, survived because alternatives were worse, because species recognized that some form of galactic governance was necessary, even if no perfect form existed. They chose cooperation over fragmentation, accepted council authority even when frustrated by its limitations, maintained unity because division meant vulnerability. And perhaps that's the deepest lesson about how power moves through the galaxy. It doesn't flow purely through strength or pure through legitimacy, not solely through visible force or solely through hidden influence. It moves through the spaces between these extremes, through pragmatic acceptance that governance requires tools both crude and subtle, through recognition that authority derives from consent, backed by capability to enforce when consent fails. The Council governs because species let them govern, because the alternative is chaos, because 2,000 years of precedent created expectations about who decides what. They govern also because they can enforce their decisions when necessary, through economic pressure and military coordination, and specters who eliminate problems that diplomacy can't solve. The soft power and hard power intertwine so thoroughly that separating them becomes impossible. This is how power quietly moves through the galaxy, not announced with fanfare or imposed through naked force, but woven into systems so complex and subtle that most beings never recognize they're being influenced until they step back and trace the threads connecting everything. The credit that makes trade possible, the treaties that govern military buildup, the intelligence networks that track threats, the specters who appear from nowhere to eliminate dangers, the council decisions that carry weight beyond their legal authority because everyone agrees they should carry weight, and that agreement itself becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a magnificent system, really. Brilliant in its sophistication, effective across scales that dwarf anything humanity built during our centuries of isolated development on Earth. It maintained peace between species that might have warred continuously without coordination mechanism. It allowed civilizations to flourish by providing security and stability. It created conditions where art and science and philosophy could develop, where traders could move safely between worlds, where individuals from species evolved on planets light years apart could meet in corridors and markets and form connections that enriched both. The Council system gave the galaxy centuries of relative peace, and that peace permitted achievements that might otherwise never have emerged. The price was sometimes high. Freedom surrendered in exchange for security. Autonomy limited by necessity of cooperation. Dissent suppressed when it threatened stability. But the alternative? The galactic anarchy that might exist without some coordination mechanism suggests the price might have been worth paying. Whether future generations agree depends on what they build from the ruins the Reapers left behind. The Council endures, but its authority must be rebuilt, reconstituted on foundations that acknowledge both the system's successes and its failures. The Spectres continue operating, but their role must evolve to handle threats that move faster than traditional council deliberation accommodates. The entire system must adapt to reality that can no longer be ignored. The galaxy is dangerous. Existential threats can emerge rapidly, and survival requires governance structures capable of decisive action alongside diplomatic patience. These are the challenges facing the post-war galaxy. How to maintain unity forged during crisis once immediate threat passes. How to balance different species' legitimate interests against collective security needs. How to preserve autonomy while accepting that some decisions must be coordinated centrally. How to grant power to institutions and individuals while preventing abuse. How to govern across species, across distances, across differences that can seem unbridgeable. The Council and Spectres represent one answer to these challenges, an answer refined over millennia and proven through survival, if not perfection. Other answers might exist, better systems waiting to be discovered. But for now, this is what the galaxy has. A council of 3 species making decisions in a tower above a station older than their civilizations, and agents operating in shadows with authority to break any law while serving justice, and a network of influence so complex that tracing how power moves becomes task requiring years of study, and even then leaves questions unanswered. It's a system built on paradox and maintained through pragmatism, held together by the understanding that perfect governance is impossible and adequate governance is essential. That species must cooperate despite having reasons to conflict. That individuals must sometimes transcend rules while serving rules' purpose. It's flawed and it's functional, inadequate and indispensable. The worst form of galactic governance, except for all the alternatives. And so the Council meets in their chambers, debating the future while learning from the past, wielding power both soft and hard to maintain order across the stars. The Spectres hunt through the galaxy, eliminating threats and creating others, serving stability through methods that destabilize, embodying the contradiction at governance's heart. The Citadel spins in space, ancient and enduring, hosting millions who barely understand how thoroughly their lives are shaped by decisions made in chambers they'll never enter, by beings they'll never meet. This is how power quietly moves in the galaxy. Not through conquest or declaration, not through democratic mandate or hereditary right, but through accumulated precedent and careful influence, through economic integration and military coordination, through intelligence networks and sanctioned killers, through systems so sophisticated that they become invisible, so effective that they seem natural, so thoroughly established that alternatives become literally unthinkable for species that have known nothing else for centuries. The Council governs the galaxy without ruling it. The Spectres enforce laws they transcend. And somehow, improbably, this contradiction functions well enough that civilization persists across the stars, that different species coexist peacefully more often than not, that individual beings can live their lives with reasonable expectation of security and justice, even if that justice sometimes comes from figures operating in shadows beyond law's reach. It's not perfect. It's not even close to perfect, but it's what the galaxy has built together, and it's survived challenges that would have shattered most human governments before they finished their first century. That longevity, that resilience, that continued functionality despite obvious flaws suggests that maybe, just maybe, they've found something worth preserving, even as they work to improve it. The lights of the Citadel glow against the void, a beacon of civilization in the darkness between stars. The Council maintains their watch. The Spectres pursue their missions, and power continues its quiet movement through the galaxy, flowing through channels both visible and hidden, shaping the fate of trillions who will never know the full extent of how much their lives are influenced by decisions made in towers and enacted in shadows, by a system of governance as complex as the galaxy it attempts to coordinate, as flawed as the species that created it, as essential as the peace it imperfectly maintains. If you've enjoyed this deep exploration into how the Council and Spectres quietly shape the galaxy, how power moves through influence rather than force, and how even imperfect systems can maintain order across the stars, consider subscribing to the channel. We dive deep into the politics, the mysteries, and the hidden mechanics of science fiction's greatest universes, exploring the details that make these worlds feel real and lived in. Hit that like button if this journey through Mass Effect's political landscape resonated with you, and let me know in the comments what other aspects of the Mass Effect universe you'd like to see explored. Until next time, rest well knowing that somewhere, in some tower above some ancient station, beings you'll never meet are making decisions that shape your world in ways you'll never fully understand. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it needs to be. Sleep well and dream of the stars.